If you're just joining us, we are in week 2 of our new sermon series, One Kingdom Indivisible. In last week's message, we began this series by going back to the beginning of time and looking at what God created, or why God created you, and why He created me, and why He created the rest of humanity. We talked about His purpose and His mission for people, that people have been blessed by God with certain gifts. He gave us the gift to be fruitful and multiply. He gave us the gift to rule over the earth and the creatures that live with us on it. He gave us the gift to enjoy the plants that God has given us for food. The blessings that we enjoy flow out of that relationship that we have with God, that we are unique among all creation because we have been made in God's image. And as His image bearers, we have received certain benefits that set us apart from everything else that God has made. You'll remember that we defined blessing this way, that blessing is the benefit on the basis of relationship. I'm going to say it again. Blessing is the benefit on the basis of relationship. God has demonstrated His blessing over us because He has given us a benefit. Be fruitful, rule over the earth, etc., that is rooted in His unique relationship with us. We are God's image bearers. And while that may be where the story of blessing begins, it is most certainly not where it ends, because just 10 chapters later, we learn about something special about God's great big plan for the rest of humanity in the story of Abraham, where God says to Abraham, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. You will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. He says all peoples will be blessed through you. God's blessings for humanity flow through humanity. In other words, we are blessed in order that we might be a blessing to somebody else. And so, like we talked about last week, sometimes we get that right. Sometimes we pour ourselves out. Sometimes we empty ourselves. We give everything we have to one another. And we live out that purpose that God has placed in us to be a blessing to somebody else. And when that happens, man, there is beauty in this world that we live in. But what about when it doesn't? What about when people get it wrong? What about when humanity completely turns away from God's purpose? What do we do when our focus, instead of being outwards, turns inward on ourselves? Because that is the question that we're seeking to explore and understand in greater depth and detail today. Because that is the story of much of the rest of the book of Genesis, a story that demonstrates the lengths that people will go to make sure that I get the blessing and you don't. You know, there was a time when I was a kid. I was out one Saturday morning. I was riding my bike all around this apartment complex that we lived in, and I came across a dog. This dog was running around my apartment complex without a leash. And all I remember about this dog is that he was big, he was really, really hairy, and he was super friendly. And so he started following me around on my bike around our apartment complex. And I didn't exactly know what to do with that. And so I went to some of my friends' apartments in the complex that we lived in. They were these two brothers. And now there were 3 of us who were out here, and we were hanging out with this loose dog. Now, I have no idea why it took me until then to figure out that I should just look on the dog's collar and look at his tag and call the owners. But eventually that's what we ended up doing. And of course the owners didn't know that their family dog had gotten out. And so they immediately come over and they pick up their pup. And as they said thank you to us, to the 3 of us, the woman handed us a $20 bill as a goodwill gesture, a nice way to say thank you. And it was a nice gesture, right? I mean, we helped someone reunite with their dog, and we all came away, $7 richer. Well, that sounds good. And I wish I could say that was how I felt that day. But it wasn't at all. Because all I could do was think about the fact that these 2 brothers were walking away with like $14 while I only got 6 or 7. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, I found the dog. I brought the dog to their house. Therefore, I should be the one to get the reward. Like that $20, that should be mine. Now, please keep in mind, I was 8 or 9 years old. This wasn't like last week or something. But all of this felt so wrong and so unfair to me. Why? Well, because I was only concerned about 3 things at that point in time. Me, myself, and I. I wanted the benefit. And I didn't feel that I should have to share that benefit. And so I whined and I moaned and I groaned. And my dad, bless his heart, was probably so sick of hearing me complain about my perceived injustice that he decided to kick in like $10 or something from his pocket to me, just to get me to stop making such a big deal about all of this. And so now I had like $16 and they had $14. And in my little delusional world, this is the only solution that made any sense. Of course, now I think back and I realize that didn't make any sense at all, but I digress. You know, sometimes the only thing that seems to matter is whether I come out on top, even if that means that you don't. I want the blessings more than I want you to have the blessings. And I don't know if you've ever personally experienced these kinds of feelings. I don't know if you'd be willing to admit it to yourself if you did. But I have a pretty strong suspicion that I'm not alone, that there are others out there who have behaved and have felt all the same things I felt that day. In fact, I think I know this to be true because I see it when I look at the world all around me. I hear it in people's behavior. I hear it in their language. All these things that emerge from various politicians. I see the fruit of it in our government legislation and policies that take place in our courts of law, right? There's never been a time in our existence where one person was more apt to take another to court for an exorbitant amount of money than there is right now. And there has never been a time in our existence where a CEO made more money relative to the average salary of one of their employees who work for them than there is right now. And there has never been as stark a wealth or prosperity gap in our country and in our world as there is right now. It is baked into our DNA to take all that we can for self, even at the expense of another. And I gotta say, that day, I was a spoiled brat. And I got away with it. And as I look around at the world that we live in, I realize that I wasn't alone. We are surrounded by people who behave and think in all the ways that I did. They are people of power. They are people of influence. They are people of renown. And why does it all keep happening? Well, because of something called impunity. And that's a really, really important word for us to understand this morning. Impunity, if that word is not a part of your regular vocabulary, it's a word that means like exemption from punishment or freedom from the injurious consequences of an action. In other words, it's a word that implies privilege or pardon or immunity. It's a word that says, I will do what I want to do for my own benefit because nobody is going to stop me. And here's the thing, impunity is as old as time itself, or at least the illusion of it. Because when the serpent approached Eve in Genesis 3 with a proposition, what was his pitch? What was his rationale to her? He said, you will not certainly die if you eat this, for God knows that when you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. You look at this, and all the serpent had to do was convince Eve that there'd be no consequences for her rebellion. And man, just like that, it was game on. And so it comes as no surprise then that it is impunity or the illusion of it that has weaved its way throughout the Genesis account. It is impunity which divides and destroys unity. It is impunity which hoards God's blessings seemingly without consequence And I say seemingly on purpose, rather. In Psalm 73, the psalmist is kind of writing about this. He's reflecting on this. He says, I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. He said, the wicked have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They're free from common human burdens. They're not plagued by human ills. Therefore, pride is their necklace, and they clothe themselves with violence. He says, from their callous hearts comes iniquity. Their evil imaginations have no limits. They scoff and speak with malice, with arrogance. They threaten oppression. Their mouths lay claim to heaven, and their tongues take possession of the earth. And then when you get to verse 12, he says this is what the wicked are like. Always free of care, they just go on amassing wealth. Guys, at first glance, the story of Genesis is simply a story about family. It's a story about mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. I mean, these are precisely the kind of people that you'd expect shared blessing from, that you'd expect unity from. But is that what we get? Well, let's take a look at some of these famous stories and you decide. In Genesis chapter 4, we meet two brothers, Cain and Abel. Abel, we're told, tended to flocks, and Cain was working the soil. And at some point, it came time for them to bring an offering before God. Now, we don't know why, but for some reason that is unclear to us, God looked favorably on Abel's offering, and he looked and felt that Cain's offering was lacking, which angered Cain. And so God saw Cain's anger, and he offered counsel. He said, Cain, do what is right, and your offering will be accepted. But he ended with a curious warning. He said, Cain, if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. These words aren't words that are just important to Cain. These are words that are vital to all of us, for all of time, quite frankly, because sin is always there. Sin is always lurking. Sin is always waiting to destroy the blessing that God has prepared for us. Cain heard God's words, and yet in that moment he acted with impunity. And in the very next verse, he took his brother Abel into a field, seemingly in a spirit of jealousy, and murdered him. This is the very first instance of murder, and it happened in only the second generation of mankind. And as God emerged back into the scene, asking Cain where Abel was, Cain gives an answer that will be critical to the story of Genesis, to the story arc that we're talking about today. He just smugly responded to God, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And I want you to remember that question that he asks, that response, because it's going to be important today. Or how about Genesis 16? In Genesis 16, God's promise of descendants to Abraham and Sarah has thus far come up empty, and so they plot to take control of the situation. Abraham will instead try for offspring with their servant Hagar. And from that encounter, Hagar gives birth to Abraham's first son, Ishmael. Yet, despite all of this being Sarah's idea, she now finds herself overcome with jealousy, overcome with anger at the mere presence of Hagar and Ishmael. And so she mistreats them and causes them great grief. And yet by Genesis 21, she's finally become pregnant with a son of her own, Isaac, right? God had kept his promise to her and to Abraham after all. But in all of this, Sarah demands something of her husband Abraham. She says, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son, Isaac. And with impunity, Sarah sent a single mom and her innocent child into the desert without a care in the world. The blessing was hoarded for Isaac, not Ishmael. And what emerged was a generations-long rivalry between two nations, the Israelites and the Ishmaelites, or the Midianites, as they're sometimes called. By Genesis 25, Isaac and Rebekah would welcome twins, children of their own, into the world. But they welcome them with a word from God. God spoke this over them. He said, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. And so at birth, Esau came first, yet Jacob, in a kind of a foreshadowing of what was to come, emerged grasping the heel of his slightly bigger brother. And as the two grow older, Jacob would barter with and receive his slightly older brother's birthright, all for a bowl of soup, a bowl of lentils. And later, as the boys neared 40 years old, a nearly blind Isaac prepared for the end of his own life by giving a blessing to his oldest son. Yet Jacob, with the help of his mother, would conspire to trick Isaac into accidentally giving his blessing to the wrong son. Jacob had bartered for the birthright, and now he had stolen Esau's blessing. And as we read, we find out Esau was so angry that he vowed that day to murder his brother Jacob. And with impunity, Jacob fled from home, hoping never to have to encounter his big brother again. In Genesis 35, we're introduced to Jacob's 12 sons. By Genesis 37, we meet Jacob's favorite. His name is Joseph, and Joseph has a dream where all of his brothers, 11 of his brothers, bow down to him. Well, as you might imagine, his brothers didn't take real kindly to Joseph's dream, and they become jealous of him. And so one day, as Joseph just comes out to meet them somewhere, they see him coming from a distance, and they begin to plot against him. They say, let's kill him, and let's throw him into one of these cisterns, and we'll just say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. By verse 27, they come to their senses, and this time they decide to sell him instead. They see a caravan of people coming by and go, hey, why don't we just sell him rather than actually kill him? Same difference, right? Well, who are these people caravanning by? Ishmaelites. And so with impunity, Joseph's brothers stripped him of his prized coat given to him by their father Jacob. They dip it in blood. They run home and they show their dad that this beloved Joseph of his has been devoured by some terrifying animal, while in reality Joseph was now a slave headed for sale in Egypt, seemingly never to be seen again. Church, that is the body of the story of Genesis. It's a story where generation after generation after generation of brothers, people who ought to be united, who ought to love one another, people who have been called to be a blessing to all nations, instead reject unity and they opt for impunity. By hook and by crook, they move to take blessing from those that they should love, and instead they keep it for themselves. So the question remains, so what's the point of all this? Well, the point is simple, really. God may have purposed humanity to bless other people, but that doesn't mean that humanity is going to listen all the time, because as he said to Cain, sin is always crouching. It's always sitting right there. It's waiting to devour us. It's striving to divide one person from another. Whenever brother divides against brother, I can promise you one thing is true. Sin has taken root, and Satan is winning. And I want you to think about that reality in light of our world today, in light of this context in which we live. If God made you, and if God made me with the express purpose that we would be a blessing to one another, and then you look at the world around us today, do we look more like a world of unity, or do we look like a world of impunity? The question's rhetorical, really, because the answer, by and large, is obvious. Remember, impunity says, I'm the exception. I get the pardon. I have the unique privilege to justify doing wrong. I can do this and I can get away with it. And as I look at the world around us, I see a world often inhabited by professing Christians who'd rather spend their time not proclaiming good news, not proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ, but instead fighting for a political platform. I see a world where Christians believe it is appropriate to get on social media and willfully spread lies about politicians and about other key figures, literally bearing false witness based on the sheer desire that some headline might be true. Doesn't matter if it is, right? Just so long as it seems within the realm of possibility of my perceptions of their character. As long as it seems true, that's enough. I see a world where Republican literally professes hatred for Democrat and Democrat for Republican. And I'm talking about Christian Republicans and Christian Democrats, and I guarantee I know there's somebody who's out there scoffing right now as if such a thing even exists. A Christian Democrat? How dare he? I see a world where relationships between siblings and parents are harmed or destroyed based on political preference. I see a world where churches are harmed or destroyed based on political preference. I see a world that still believes that a person's value or worth can be derived by the color or shade of a person's skin. A world where churches still identify as predominantly white or predominantly black. I see a world so uncomfortable with 3 words professing the value of black lives that some will go to any length to misconstrue the spirit of that message. I see a world where warfare seems to be a suitable answer for any difficult to solve international crisis. I see a world of armed civilians loaded and ready to kill at a moment's notice at the first perceived threat to liberty. I see a world all around us of helpless lives being taken or exploited or marginalized, whether those lives be infant or immigrant or innocent. You know, several months ago, the world watched in horror as an officer kneeled on the neck of a black man named George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. All this over allegations of passing counterfeit money. He cried for help. He cried for his mom. He cried for oxygen. And he was deprived of it all. And in the weeks to come, what emerged? It was not a united outcry for justice or for the sanctity of human life made in the image of God, but it was a fight between 2 groups of people to see who could be louder, who mattered more, black lives or blue lives. Sometimes it seems that division is all we know. Church history is a lesson in division all the same. Now you look at 1054 AD, 1,000 years ago, the church in Rome chose to separate from what is now known as the Eastern Orthodox Church to form the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, it's interesting, those 2 churches form the bookends right here on Brotherhood Way, Orthodox, Catholic. In 1517, 500 years ago, Martin Luther nailed 95 protests against the Roman Catholic Church to a door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany. And he began a movement of Protestantism, protesting things. And in the 500 years since then, the church has divided and divided and divided, to the tune that some estimate maybe as many as 40,000 distinct Christian movements that exist today. I don't actually think it's that high, but you get the point. Division is what we do. It's what we do throughout church history. It's what we do in politics. It's what happened back in Genesis. And every time it happens, it is normalized and it is rationalized from a place of impunity, from a spirit that says, I know I'm supposed to be united, but this is bad. This is the exception. This time I can choose division. This time I can choose hatred. This time I can choose fighting and I can choose warfare. I want to be clear. This is not my perception of the Lake Merced Church of Christ. This is a message and a series that I think addresses the broader community of Christendom. And it's designed to remind us of where our allegiances lie. Church, we have a king. We belong to a kingdom. But that kingdom is not of this world. Yet where we sit today, our king has given us not just words to live by, but commands from the very God who created us and purposed us. Commands that dictate how we're supposed to treat one another. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus preaches the very first sermon, right? He addresses the behavior of his followers, how they treat one another with powerful words. And he says things like, hey, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. And he says, anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But watch what Jesus does. He says, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. A few verses later, he says, hey, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But he says, but I tell you something different. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Guys, notice there's no conditional clause in Jesus' words. He doesn't say, love your neighbor unless. No, he says, love your enemies. Full stop. End of story. And that love has certain attributes or characteristics that we should know. Paul describes love for us in 1 Corinthians 13. He describes what love is. He describes what it looks like. And this is what he says. He says, love is patient. Love is kind. It doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. It's not proud. It doesn't dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. I want you to reflect on those words and then imagine a political campaign that wasn't boastful or dishonoring of others. To imagine that campaign is unconscionable to me. Yet that is what love looks like, without exception. The reality is that we live in a world right now that is probably as divided as most of us have ever seen. It's a world that is 180 degrees different from the united country that I think I remember on September 12th, 2001. In 19 years, we've gone from the most united most of us have ever seen to the most divided most of us have ever seen. So much so that it makes you question whether we were even as united as we thought we were back then. The reality is, whatever the truth is, division surrounds us on every single side, and plenty of the people practicing and participating in that divisive behavior are people who also say they profess Christ as their Lord and Savior. And it is with impunity that many of us are choosing to make ourselves the exception to the rule rather than the rule, rather than by abiding by Jesus' words for us, rather than by abiding in God's ultimate purpose for humanity to be a blessing to all nations. All nations. If anybody had a reason, or what would seem to be a good enough reason, rather, to divide or to harbor ill will or to harbor hate, it would have been Joseph. And yet, as many of you know, Joseph's story didn't end with a caravan of Ishmaelites hauling him off to slavery, did it? No, in fact, Joseph had a special relationship with dreams. And as he sat in prison for a crime he did not commit, he learned that Pharaoh, the king of all of Egypt, had a dream of his own, a dream that troubled him, the kind that he was convinced meant something significant for his life. We've all had those dreams. And so Pharaoh, having learned of Joseph's reputation, sends for Joseph to interpret his dream, a dream that warned Pharaoh that there would be 7 years of feast, followed by 7 years of a severe famine, the kind of famine that you better save up to prepare for. A famine not altogether unlike what many of us are experiencing and enduring right now. Pharaoh looked at Joseph. He looked at a Hebrew slave and a prisoner, and he said, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." In a moment, Joseph had gone from left for dead, slave, and prisoner to the second most powerful person in Egypt. And when those years of famine came, only one nation, only one people was prepared. It was Joseph's Egypt. The surrounding nations who were starving, who had no food, they heard that Egypt did. And people came from all around to Joseph just to come eat and survive. And it just so happened that there was a man with 11 surviving sons in Canaan who was hungry too. And in Genesis 42, they are all sent by their father Jacob to Egypt to gather some food for the family. The text says that Joseph immediately recognizes them, but they don't notice him. He's been gone a long time, and they presumed him dead a long time ago. Joseph might be my favorite story in the whole Bible. I'm getting goosebumps right now just telling this story. I get goosebumps every time I read it, every time I tell it. And I don't have the time to review the whole story right now, but suffice to say, Joseph yanks their chain a little bit. He scares them a little before finally revealing himself to his brothers in Genesis 45. Because in Genesis 45, it says Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out. He said, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had done so, he said, "I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." After all that Joseph had been through, what's the first thing that he says to his brothers? He says, "Come close to me." It's the exact opposite of everything you'd expect. The exact opposite of the brotherly divide that wreaked havoc throughout the pages of Genesis preceding it. As the pages of Genesis draw to a close, Joseph is able to reunite with his beloved father. He's able to see Jacob before Jacob dies. And it's no coincidence that Jacob's final act before he breathes his last is to speak blessings over each of his sons and over Joseph's sons, giving each the blessing appropriate to him. Remember, that's the motif of Genesis. And in the final recorded act of Joseph's life before he dies, the text says this: "His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. 'We are your slaves,' they said. But Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.' And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them." Church, Joseph had every right, it would seem, to act with impunity. He didn't. His final act was an act of complete and total unity. It was an act of love. It was the kind of love that is patient and kind and does not envy or boast and does not keep record of wrongs. It was the kind of love that always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Cain's question of God, way back at the beginning, was an indignant, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And yet, as Genesis draws to a close, that's exactly who Joseph is. He is his brother's keeper. Church, that is the vision that God has for humanity. That is the vision that God has for you and for me. Friends, sin is always crouching. It's always waiting to divide and devour us. But love, real love, says, "Come close to me. I will provide for you and your children." Church, if you get nothing else from today's message, it's this: we cannot live in unity as long as we live with impunity. In other words, we can't talk about being the United States or the church as long as we're willing to let ourselves off the hook and make an exception every time unity gets hard. Unity is hard. What Joseph did is far more difficult than what his flesh or his sinful nature probably wanted to do. Unity is hard, but unity is what we are called to. In Psalm 133, the psalmist says how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. In John 17, what does Jesus pray on behalf of all believers? He says, "My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, that they may be brought to complete unity." In Ephesians, Paul writes, and he says, "Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." And so, church, that's a question that we have to contend with this morning. Are we making every effort to keep unity? Are you making every effort to keep unity? We cannot live in unity as long as we live with impunity. We cannot give ourselves a pass on this. We cannot justify our anger and division or separation from one another. As Christians, we cannot divide over who is in the White House. We cannot divide over which party that we are registered under. We cannot divide over which lives matter. We cannot divide over the color of our skin. We cannot divide over matters of guns and gun control. We cannot divide over capitalism and socialism. We cannot divide over COVID-19, and we cannot divide over face masks. We cannot do it. We cannot divide with impunity and then hypocritically say that Jesus is our Lord. Because if Jesus is our Lord, Jesus calls all of us to unity, regardless of culture, regardless of skin color, regardless of political affiliation or economic policy or face masks. You may not want to all the time, and that's okay. But if Joseph can look at his brothers After all that he'd been through, and if he can say, come close to me, you better bet that you and I are capable of it too. We cannot live in unity as long as we live with impunity. Friends, our reasons for division are not good enough. Jesus does the dividing when he separates the weeds from the wheat, when he separates the faithful from the unfaithful, the believers from the unbelievers. That is his job. And until then, unity and blessing are our jobs. And friends, I don't know where you are as you hear this message today, but Jesus wants to be your Lord. And Jesus wants to be your Savior, and he invites you. He invites you into relationship with him today, a relationship that will save you for all of eternity. Friends, there will come a day when he will sift through us, sift from among us those who have received his grace and his mercy and those who have not. If you wish to be among those he saves, then I want to invite you to receive him today. You can email us at questions@lakemercedchurch.com, and we will walk with you on your journey. We invite you to unite with us. In the grace of Jesus, join our family, join our church family, and I pray this week that you will. God bless you. I will see you next time.